Back from the dead.
Chapter 5, Clinging to Stone. The recess behind the great boulder was less a sanctuary and more a suspended moment between drowning and freezing. The roar of the torrent filled the small space, a physical pressure that vibrated through the stone beneath them, through their very bones. Cold was absolute, insidious. It seeped through their soaked garments, relentlessly leaching warmth, stiffening muscles, turning breath into ragged, visible puffs even in the profound darkness. Water dripped constantly from the overhang above, landing with cold splashes on their heads and shoulders, mimicking the relentless rain outside their fragile shield. Kenjiro huddled close to Akari, trying to block the worst of the spray with his own body. Her shivering was no longer intermittent. It was a constant, violent tremor that shook her slight frame uncontrollably. Her teeth clicked together in a rapid, desperate rhythm that was audible even over the muted roar of the river. He could feel the alarming cold radiating from her, even through the layers of wet cloth separating them. Exposure was setting in fast, a silent killer more patient but no less deadly than Sato's men. He placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, feeling the tremors beneath his palm. "Akari-sama," he began, his voice low and rough against the noise, but she flinched, startled, her eyes wide and unfocused in the gloom. He quickly withdrew his hand. Shock and cold were clouding her senses. They couldn't stay here. Another hour, perhaps less, and the cold would claim her or render her too weak to move at all. He, too, felt the deep chill settling into his core, a leaden exhaustion weighing down his limbs, slowing his thoughts. He fought it, forcing his mind back to the tactical reality. Rest was death. Cautiously, Kenjiro edged towards the gap between their sheltering boulder and the ravine wall. Peering out, he scanned the scene. The main channel of the river raged mere feet away, a churning chaos of dark water and white foam under the storm-swept sky. Above, the torches still flickered on the ridge, distant fireflies against the oppressive blackness. They seemed stationary for now, perhaps gathered, deciding on their next move. Had they lost the trail completely? Or were they assuming the river had already done their work for them? Complacency now would be fatal. He knew Sato, the man was tenacious. He would assume nothing. He would order a search of the banks. Kenjiro's gaze followed the sheer cliff face downstream. It was mostly smooth, water-slicked rock, plunging directly into the turbulent water. But perhaps 20 paces further on, dimly perceived through the spray and gloom, a narrow ledge appeared, barely wider than a man's foot, tracing a horizontal line along the rock face about 10 feet above the current waterline. It seemed to follow the curve of the ravine. Above it, the cliff remained impossibly steep, but the ledge itself, it was a path. A suicidal path, perhaps, slick with rain and spray, exposed, treacherous. But it was a way asterisk forward without immediately re-entering the lethal embrace of the river. He ducked back into the recess. Akari hadn't moved, still shivering violently, her head bowed, clutching the lacquered box within her sodden cloak like a talisman against the encroaching cold. "Akari-sama," Kenjiro said again, pitching his voice to cut through her daze and the river's roar. "We must move, now." She looked up slowly, her eyes holding a terrifying emptiness for a moment before flickering with comprehension and renewed fear. "Move? Where?" Her voice was a thin, trembling thread. "The river." "Not the river. Along the cliff," Kenjiro explained quickly, pointing towards the direction of the ledge. "There is a path, narrow, dangerous, but it takes us away from here." He didn't add that it might lead nowhere or simply deposit them back into the churning water further downstream. Hope, however slim, was a necessary ration. He helped her to her feet, his hands briefly registering the shocking coldness of her arms even through the wet fabric. She swayed, her legs unsteady, her breath catching in sharp gasps as the full force of the damp, chilling air hit her anew. Kenjiro steadied her, gripping her arm firmly. "You must hold onto the rock face. Find handholds. Move slowly. Do not look down. Understand." She nodded mutely, her eyes fixed on his face, drawing strength from his forced calm. Her shivering seemed to lessen marginally with the imperative to act, replaced by a taut focus born of sheer terror. "Stay behind me," Kenjiro instructed. "Step where I step." He took a deep breath, the icy air searing his lungs, and pushed himself out from behind the boulder's protection, back into the full sensory assault of the ravine. The roar of the river surged back to its deafening crescendo. Spray lashed at them, cold and blinding. Kenjiro moved cautiously along the narrow bank towards the start of the ledge, testing each foothold on the loose, wet scree. He reached the cliff face and paused, looking up. Water streamed down the black rock, making it gleam treacherously. He found the first handhold, a small crack in the stone, and pulled himself up onto the beginning of the ledge. It was appallingly narrow. His feet, clad in soaked Waragi sandals, barely fit. He pressed his body flat against the cold, wet rock, feeling the vibrations of the torrent below through the soles of his feet and the palms of his hands as he sought purchase. He glanced back, extending a hand down to Akari. "Come," he urged, his voice tight, "slowly." Akari hesitated for only a heartbeat, then reached for his hand. He pulled her up onto the ledge beside him. She gasped as her feet slipped on the slick surface, her fingers scrabbling desperately for a hold on the rock face. Kenjiro held her steady, pinning her momentarily against the cliff with his own body until she found a secure handhold. Her face was inches from his, pale and rain-streaked, her eyes wide with primal fear, reflecting the churning water below. But beneath the fear, he saw again that flicker of steely resolve. The daughter of Lord Fujiwara would not surrender easily. "Move," he commanded softly, and began the traverse. Progress was agonizingly slow. Each step was a calculated risk. Find a handhold, test it. Find a foothold, test it. Shift weight, repeat. Kenjiro moved with disciplined precision, his senses hyper-alert, feeling the texture of the rock, the subtle shifts in balance, the constant, hungry pull of the abyss roaring below. He tried to call out warnings, "Loose rock here. Careful, very slick," but his words were often snatched away by the wind and the river's noise. He relied on brief backward glances, watching Akari mimic his movements, her small hands, scraped and bleeding, desperately seeking purchase on the unforgiving stone. She kept the arm holding the ledger pressed tight against the rock, using her other hand and her body to maintain balance. The borrowed cloak hampered her, catching on small jags of rock, but she didn't dare try to adjust it. They edged along the face, inch by agonizing inch. The ledge dipped and rose, widened slightly, then narrowed again to almost nothing, forcing them to rely entirely on handholds. Rain sluiced down the rock, finding its way down their necks, further chilling their already numb bodies. Kenjiro felt his own fingers growing stiff, clumsy with cold, threatening his grip. He flexed them constantly, forcing blood back into them, fighting the encroaching numbness. Time lost meaning. There was only the rock, the roar, the cold, and the next precarious step. Kenjiro's focus narrowed to the few feet of ledge immediately before him, the few inches of rock within his grasp. He dared not look too far ahead, nor back at the torches that might still be watching from the ridge. Survival was measured in single heartbeats, single successful movements. Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar, sharper and more immediate than the water's thunder. A sharp bark, then another closer than before, seemingly echoing from within the ravine itself, downstream. Kenjiro froze, straining his ears. Had the dogs somehow been brought down to the riverbank, or were they tracking along the opposite side? Then another sound. Shouting. Male voices carried on a gust of wind swirling up the canyon. Indistinct words, lost in the chaos, but undeniably human, undeniably hostile, and seemingly closer than the torches on the ridge. Kenjiro risked a quick glance downstream, following the curve of the ledge. Through the mist and spray, perhaps 50 yards ahead, where the ravine widened slightly and the cliff face seemed less sheer, he saw it the flicker of torchlight low down near the water's edge. Not just one, but two, casting wild, dancing shadows. Figures moved near the lights, indistinct but purposeful. They were searching the bank, moving upstream towards them. Trapped, the hunters were closing in from behind along the ridge, and now, apparently from ahead along the riverbank as well. Their desperate gamble in the river had bought them time, but the net was closing. The narrow ledge, their only path forward, was leading them directly towards discovery. Kenjiro pressed himself tighter against the cold stone, shielding Akari with his body. He could feel her trembling intensify again, no longer just from cold, but from the raw terror of imminent capture. The roar of the river suddenly felt like the roar of a closing trap. Their fragile sanctuary of motion had evaporated. They were exposed, exhausted, and clinging desperately to a sliver of rock between the fury of the flood and the closing jaws of their pursuers. The weight of the heron's feather felt impossibly heavy, a symbol not of hope, but of the crushing burden of a promise that seemed, in this moment, impossible to keep.